Hi guys, good morning. So for today, we will be discussing about essential requisites of contracts. We will be determining what comprises consent of contracting parties. Second, identify the requisites for a valid object. And lastly, to understand the cause of the contract. So that's it, Pansit. Let us start. So, introduction. Any form of contract have three essential elements rather. Well, they are just the same. First is consent, object, and cause. Without these three, there can be no contract at all. This lesson will discuss the three requisites and how they affect the provisions. Supposedly, this is the second of the three lessons for contracts. However, again, due to time constraint, we will not be able to discuss the lesson 3. But nevertheless, I'll be sending the lesson 2 and the lesson 3. For the lesson 3, it will just be for reading purposes only. So, activity, element identification, identify the essential element found in the contracts. So, submit it to me by Sunday. That will be January 17. Okay. So, let's start. Article 1319 consent is manifested by meeting of the offer and the acceptance upon the thing and the cause which are to constitute the contract. So basically, there is an offer and an acceptance. An offer coming from one side and an acceptance for the other. And upon the happening of which, there is, as we have discussed in the previous lesson, that there is that meeting of the minds. So the offer must be certain and the acceptance must be absolute. A qualified acceptance constitute a counter offer. Acceptance made by letter or telegram does not bind the offerer except from the time it came to his knowledge. So each of these lines will be discussed in the succeeding pages. So requisites of consent, these are the 5. Let us discuss one by one. First is, it must be manifested by the concurrence of the offer and the acceptance with respect to object and the cause. So for every given agreement and at the same time contract, there would always be an offer. Something like, sige bay, akong palito na imong kotse. Sige bay, atong buhaton ni nga butang. Ato tong adtoon dito. So basically, there is that offer to do, to give, or to not to do. So that is a unilateral proposition which one party makes to the other for the celebration of the contract. Now, an offer must be certain. How can we say that it is certain? It is definite, so that upon the acceptance of an agreement can be reached in the whole contract, not definite if object is not determinate. So at least man lang, in order for it to be certain, it must be definite. It must be klaro in a sense nga kabalota kung asa lang taman, kung asa dili siya dapat. So that when the other party agrees, we will both know to what extent the contract will be. Something like, if we are talking of 2 years, kanos ang magsugod ang 2 years? January 1, 2021 or 2 years in a sense nga after ko graduate or after ko makakwarta, something like that. It must be definite. It must be complete, indicating with sufficient clearness the kind of contract intended and definitely stating the essential conditions of the proposed contract. So, in this sense, it must be complete without any hidden terms, hidden policies. So, common kayo ninyo, especially sa atuang mga Pinoy, in a way nga, for example, mangutang ta or magkuha tag postpaid plan sa Globe or sa Smart na ay papirmahan sa atoa, for most of us, probably 99% of us, will not really read the entire contract kung sa ginaingon dito. But it is safe to assume that it is complete. But nevertheless, complete or incomplete, we still make our pirma. Pirma lang mangyapon ta, no? So without really knowing what are the terms, matingala na lang ta. For example, sa internet, tingala na lang ta nga lock-in die for 2 years, 3 years. Tapos kung ipaputol na to, kay bayaran na to ang remaining months. Tapos may tang ay, wa mo ko kabalo. Tapos they will just be having this argument nga, Che, wa kabalo nga na, ni pirma ba ka na, beto sa kontrata, and wala na tayong magagawa pag ganun. So, intentional, should be serious and not made just for fun. So, when we engage into contracts, it is not, ano ba, para bag ka ng, dili ni siya binuang. Okay? It should be intentional, should be taken seriously, and not just paid for fun. We cannot just say nga, saan ay, kuhan man to, kanang, atik-atik raman to, something like that. Okay, Article 1321 talks about that the person making the offer may be able to fix the time, sang orasa, kung asa dapit, as well as the manner of acceptance of the one receiving the offer, all of which must be complied with. If ever na nga nag-agree si person B sa offer ni person A, then the time, the place, and the manner of acceptance stipulated in their contract must be complied with because, again, it was accepted. When made through the agent, accepted from the time acceptance communicated to the agent. So, Article 1322, an offer made through an agent is accepted from the time the acceptance is communicated to him. So, there are instances wherein we cannot deal directly with the person that we are making offer to. However, naa siya'y agent, ahente, or representative that is authorized, remember authorized. So, naa siya'y authority to receive the offer. However, to relay the offer to person B, for example. So, the contract will not be made by simply communicating to the agent. And at the same time, the agent does not have authority over the acceptance. Okay? Kailangan to niya i-relay sa iyahang bossing, sa iyang amo. So, in terms of having an agent or making the offer to the agent, the contract will only be accepted and valid if the offer was already communicated to the principal person as well as being accepted by him. Kaya kung sa agent lang, wala. Okay guys, for 1323, an offer becomes ineffective upon the death, civil interdiction, insanity, or insolvency of either party before acceptance is conveyed. So this happens when si offerer, si Juan. Juan made an offer to Pedro to buy his house for 10 million pesos. Now, before the acceptance of Pedro to that said offer by Juan, namatay siya, death, or there is that civil interdiction, insanity, or insolvency of either party. So basically, na-I offer but wala na-accept because of this circumstance. So the offer becomes ineffective. So even if the offer is still there, but provided that there is this four circumstance nga na experience sa parties, then the offer becomes ineffective. The reason for this is that to protect both of the parties, because siguro katong nga offer gibuhat to niya because himsog pa siya. That is why he made an offer for 10 million. However, because of nabuang or because of insolvency, nausab ang circumstance nila financially. So in order to protect the parties, the offer becomes ineffective. So dili pwede maingon si Pedro nga, ako na ba itong gi-accept ang imong offer, dapat palito na jud to nimo, considering nga insolvent na si Juan. Meaning sa insolvent is mga assets niya, mga properties niya is kanang are not available already. Okay? So wala na siya ikapalit sa 10 million. So the offer becomes ineffective. Again, by way to protect the parties. Business is advertisement of things for sale. So Article 1325, unless it appears otherwise, business advertisement of things for sale are not offers, but mere invitation to make an offer. So the reason for this is that when we see business advertisement, these are just marketing, okay? These are just ways to reach out to the customers to make an offer or to somewhat attract them to buy these products. These are not definitive offers. Like for example, nakabutang diha sa bulletin board or sa let's say sa tarpaulin, batang nato 40 pesos, Jolly Spaghetti buy one take one. Madto to nakabutang dito sa tarpaulin, tas madto ka sa Jollibee karon. So papalit ako atong tag 40 pesos nga Jollibee Spaghetti buy one take one. Ay sir, wala ba may ngana sir? Ay human naman ang promo sir. So human na, so wala. Naabi to dito sa tarpaulin. So bisan pag naa dito sa tarpaulin guys, 1325 tells us that those are not definitive offers. Basically, those are just mere invitation to make an offer. Okay? So, the business or Jollibee will not be obliged to give you 40 pesos buy one take one spaghetti. So, advertisement for bidders are simply invitations to make proposal, and advertiser is not bound to accept the highest or lowest bidder unless the contrary appears. So, as far as I know, in terms of bidding, ang practice dyan na is the one with the lowest bid will be the one to receive the contract. However, even if siya ang lowest bidder, if the quality nga iyahang gina-offer for the products needed has not met the requirement, then the one that organized the bidding process is not actually obliged to receive or to accept the lowest bidder or the highest bidder, because at the end of the day, they will be ang ilahang dawaton nga bid is the one that is most fit para sa ilahang pangangailangan. So even if lowest bidder ka pero substandard man po na mong gina-offer, then it's not a guarantee that, or it's the one that have organized the bid is not obliged to accept your proposal. An accepted offer does not give rise to consent. So when we talk of acceptance, which is the acceptance of the offer or the proposed agreement, an accepted offer does not give rise to consent. So basically, wala jud tay kontrata hisgutan if the offer is unaccepted. Okay? Dili ta tawag nito. It does not mean nga silence means yes. Wala yung ana no nga wala man ka nag-communicate, wala man ka naingon nga di nimo dawaton, so it is safe to assume nga dawaton nimo. So wala yung ana. We have to be very clear in black and white yun na siya. So it does not mean nga walay gi hatag nga acceptance, wala pod pasabot ato is gidawat niya. So acceptance must be there sa ta. Contract is perfect when the offer, the counter offer learns about the acceptance. So again, when the offer or the counter offer has been met by acceptance, then the contract is created. So, pag mag-abot na gani na sila, regardless kung asa na sila mag-abot, then we are already having a contract, regardless kung nakasulat or wala. Must be absolute. So, the kind of acceptance. So, kung mag-accept gani ka sa terms sa offer, it should be absolute. Dili pwede nga, ay, dawato na ako na pero dapat tayong anay. So, it's not an acceptance, but a counter offer. So, pag maingon niya kag okay, gidawat na ko ni, you are accepting, you are receiving the entirety of the terms being proposed by the offeror. Ana lang siya. Walay, dili ka pwede maingon nga. Di ba nag-ingon ko nga wala ni siya dapat labot tapos nakapirma na rin ka. So, it does not work that way. So, if naay portion nga dili ka ganahan sa offer, then you are actually making a counter offer, not a conditional acceptance. So, it's a counter offer. Okay, kung mahatag na kag-acceptance, then it means, or it is safe to assume, that all of the terms and policies nga nakasulat dito, gidawat nimo. Absolutely. So, implied arise from acts or facts which reveal the intent to accept, such as the consumption of the things sent to the offeree. There are also instances where it implied ang acceptance. Like for example, bay, baligyan ako ni sa imuha, o ganang, nakoy pagkaon ni ba, bali 1,000, ibaligyan ako ni sa imuha. Gidala sa imong office, gibiyaan. Okay? Wala kay giingon niya imong dawaton or imong paliton, pero imong gikaon. And nahurot na nimo kaon, okay? So there are instances nga naay implied acceptance. Even if wala nimo siya giingon or gisulat niya kung dawaton akong paliton sa ngalan nga gikaon nimo, nahurot nimo. So it is safe to assume that you have accepted the offer and you will be bound to pay for that food. Lain pud no nga gihurot na nimo ang pizza for example, tas mayhon ka nga, oh, naingon balay ko nga paliton nako. Pero wala na, hurot ng pizza. So, it is it can be considered as an implied acceptance. Okay, so those are just implied. Tapos, napunta express. Pag express gani, black and white, dawat jud, gisugot jud, or gipalit jud. Klaro jud sa both parties nga mo to ilang sabot. Implied, mo na itong i-discuss na ako ganina. And 1319 also talks about qualified. Not an acceptance but constitute a counter offer. So, gi-qualify ang offer mo bang sige dawaton ako ni pero dapat wala ni or dapat naa ni. So, it's not an acceptance but rather a counter offer. If made by letter or telegram. Now, what happens when the acceptance is made through letter or telegram? Pero sahay, yeah, naa pa mangyapon in business dealings wherein ipadala ang contract, basahon nimo, pirmahan nimo or what. So, the paragraph 2 of Article 1319, acceptance made by letter or telegram does not bind the offer except from the time it came to his knowledge. Okay? So, there is no contract yet. For example, ang kontrata gisulod sa envelope, gipadala dito sa katong second party. Okay, nisugot siya sa terms, blah, blah, blah. Tapos, the contract is not yet created because if ipaagi ka natin siyang letter or telegram, dapat ang katong acceptance will be made known or to mahibalan dapat sa offerer. What I'm trying to say is, if si offerer nagpadala og letter kay offeree, okay, inya gidawat niya, tapos ipabalik na po niya ang letter, the contract is only perfected pag nakabalik na ang letter sa offerer, unya, nakabalo na siya unsay responding offeree. So that's the time. Not at the moment nga ni pirma sa dito. Period of acceptance. 1324. When the offerer has allowed the offeree a certain period to accept, offeree may accept any time until such period expires. So there are moments wherein the offerer sends an offer to the offeree, tapos they are given time to study, to go over the terms and policies of the contract, and also at the same time, there is a period being given. So, the acceptance of the offeree must be communicated to the offerer within that period, because after niya gihatag yung acceptance beyond the period, then it will tantamount to a counter offer, and thus paabot na po sa acceptance sa original nga nag-offer. Contract of option. A contract of option is like having a contract between two parties to wait. Okay, magpaabot. For example, if there is a seller of a car, tapos paminaw nimo barato kayo, sulit kayo siya, pero nangita pa kag asa ka makapangitag kwarta pangpalit. So instead of simply saying ay ba i-reserve ra guna sa kuha. So you may engage into a contract of option wherein pwede nimo siya bayaran nga magpaabot in a way, in a sense nga dili niya i-offer, di niya ibaligya sa lain until such time nga ma-expire ang contract of option. So after ma-expire ang contract of option, pwede niya paliton ang kotse, pwede po niya dili idayon. Pero ang katong nabayad niya para sa contract of option will be in the hands of the seller already. Kay katong bayad para mo to sa ihang pagpaabot. Sana all na bayad magpaabot. So, preparatory contract in which one party grants the other for a fixed period and under specified conditions the power to decide whether or not to enter into a principal contract. So, necessary legal capacities of the parties. So, be reminded that in a contract, kailangan niya na ay consent in order for it to be valid. Now, there are times wherein a person cannot give a valid consent. So, 1327 tells us that there are three. Number one are unemancipated minors, meaning minors, those that are not of the majority of age, 17 years old, below 18 years old. So, bisan pag mag-18 na kasunod bulan, mag-18 na kaugma, sa ngalan niya as of now, at the time and perfection of contract, you are still a minor, then your consent is invalid. The same goes for people nga buang and mga limtanon, and at the same time, sa mga buta-bungol, dili, bungol o amang o bungol. Balik-balik na, balik lang. So why? Because the law, the government, and basically the law wanted to protect these people because they are assumed to not be able to give an intelligent consent. Kumbaga, wala pa sila buot ba sa paghatag o tama nga judgment o tama nga decision in terms of entering into a contract. So, bisan pa nakapirma na sila diya sa ngalan nga they could not give consent, those will be considered voidable. Okay, when offer and or acceptance is made. So, there are instances wherein kaning mga ginatawag na to nga mga buang enters into a state of lucid interval. So, unsay may tabo sa lucid interval? Nasa libuot, okay? For some unknown reason or something unexplainable reason, nibalik sila, nagkabuot sila, balik. Okay? So, if one could prove that kaning a person who is known to be a buang, tapos nag-enter into a contract, nagpirma siya, pero di ito sa pag-enter niya into contract, nasa sa iyang lucid interval, nasa sa iyang tama nga panghimuot, niya after niya napirmahan, nabasa ang nasabtan, nagbuang na po sa balik. So, if you could prove that one, then the contract is valid. For those nga mga hubog, as in nahubog na dyan, their consent will just only be voidable. They could annul or ratify it. So, kung dili na sila hubog, magbasa nila dito sa kontrata na sila ipirma, pwede nila ipa-annul, pawalang bisa, or pwede po nila i-ratify, ipabisa ang kanang kontrata. The same goes if you are signing or entering into a contract under a hypnotic spell. The consent must be intelligent, free, spontaneous, and real. So, yun yung sabi ko kanina na it should be something na pinag-isipan na within your judgment, na timbang-timbang nimo, na consult nimo. So, intelligently, freely, spontaneously, and real ang imong paghatag sa imong consent without any strings attached. A contract where consent is given through mistake, violence, intimidation, undue influence, fraud, or fraud is voidable. So, again, voidable contracts are those that may be ratified or annulled. So, mistake and violence, we will be going over each one of them. Spontaneous and intelligent, effect of defects of will. Contract is voidable. So, if you have given your consent out of mistake, wala kanabang nasipyat ka or kanang ginaingon nga maling akala mo kasi ganito, akala mo ganyan, that is why you have entered into a contract, it will be voidable. So it may be annulled on grounds nga if kabalo, kung kabalo lang unta ka nga mauto sa dapat, the question is mo enter pa ba gihapon ka sa kontrata. If dili, then there are grounds na pwede siya ma-annul. But if ever mistake sa tungod kay katangahan nimo, klaro na siya, gilatag na sa imo ang detalye pero nagpatara lang ka, wala mo basaha, nag-assume lang ka sa mga bagay-bagay, then that might be a grounds to not be able to annul your contract. So there are kinds of mistake. Mistakes of fact generally not a ground for annulment of contracts. Ground of mistake based on error is limited to cases in which it may reasonably be said that without such error, the consent would have not been given. So, if the mistake, sama sa akong ingon ganina, if the mistake, kung kabalo lang ka nga dili di ay tumao, mo enter pa ba gihapon ka into a contract? If the answer is no, then that may be ground to annul the contract. But if the answer is yes, then it shall be, the validity will be continued. Effect of mistake is determined by whether the parties would still have entered into the contract despite the knowledge of the true fact. So kung hibala nimo ang tinuod, mosulod pa bagyapon ka sa kontrata. The consequence would depend whether the answer is yes or no. Okay. What if as to principal condition? Be reminded that conditions are future or uncertain or in the past but unknown. So upon the happening of which will give rise or extinguish a contract. So if the principal condition was believed to be a mistake, then it invalidates consent and thus invalidates the contract as a whole. As to identity or qualification of one of the parties. Again, if abinimo, for example, abinimo accountant siya, mao nang nagpa-konsulta ka sa iya sa business only to find out nga dili di ay. Pero nakapirma na ka sa kontrata, what will happen to your consent? What will happen to the contract? Again, it depends. So in that case, since na-enter ka into a contract believing that this person is a certified public accountant only to find out nga dili, then there are grounds for annulment. However, if you are nagpa-bookkeeping lang man ka sa iya, which can be done by non-accountants, then the contract might be valid. I'll just skip this one. Mistakes that do not affect the validity of the contract. Error with respect to accidental qualities of the object of the contract. When we talk of accidental qualities, these are not principal and thus will not affect the validity of the contract. For example, if you are buying a racehorse, tapos ang primary quality nga gipangita nimo is pang racing, which is pang racing man jud siya, isaswapen niya nasay alom sa iyahang dalunggan, ya di ka ganahan. Okay? So bisan pag wala ka kabalongan atoy alom sa dalunggan, ya di ka ganahan, the contract will still be valid because in the first place nipalit man kag kabayo for racing purposes. Error in the value of the thing. So there are more, example, Bitcoin right now is fluctuating so much, taas baba. Ito naging adlaw, 2 million, nag-drop into 1.6 million, karon almost 1.9 na siya. So if nipalit ka og Bitcoin tapos nag-enter ka into a contract of sale, tapos nipalit nimo sa believing nga 2 million din iyang price, tapos only to find out nga 1.8, 1.6 na lang di ay. So it will not invalidate the contract because that is just an error in the value of the thing. Error which refers to the condition not Error which refers not to conditions of the thing but to accessory matters in the contract foreign to the definition of the object. Again, if those are just accessory matters, if it's not the principal thing, that it will not affect the validity of the contract. Sorry for nag-stutter ko guys, so wag na. Sangit-sangit akong dila. Error of law. Mistake as to the existence of a legal provision or as to its interpretation or application. Okay? So what if you have entered into a contract with an error in terms of law? Kanabang you were believed nga pwede ni siya, only to find out nga dili di ay illegal din na siya, what will happen? General rule, ignorancia lehis neminem excusat. Article 3 of the Civil Code, ignorance of the law excuses no one from compliance therewith. Like for example, nagpalit ka og kinawat nga kabalo kang kinawat nga motor or kotse gipalit gihapon nimo. Tapos moingon ka nga ay wala man ko kabalo. Okay? So sa ngalan niya bawal na siya. Then or let's say mali akong example. Sa may bawal na nga. Probably wala ka kabalo. So may pwede na to example. Okay. Sa motor, what if, for example, palit kag motor, tapos modified ang iyang tambutso, tapos bawal to siya. Then, assuming nga wala juga kabalo nga bawal, ipalit lang gihapon nimo siya. But since the object is illegal, there are grounds to cancel the contract of sale. What will happen to you? As naman kayo pwede buhaton, but again, you could not keep the object because in the first place, that is an illegal object because of the modified muffler niya. So, di po ka pwede mo ingon, ay, wala mo kabalo. Because again, regardless kung kabalo ka or wala, sa ngalan niya balaod na, you are bound to comply with it. Exception also, there will always be exception to the rule. 1334, mutual error as to the legal effect of an agreement when the real purpose of the parties is frustrated. So, it may vitiate a consent and may thus maging voidable ang contract. Requisites for mutual error of law. Error must be as to the legal effect of an agreement, includes rights and obligations of the parties, not as stipulated in the contract, but as provided by law. So these are instances wherein both of the contracting parties are having legal constraints or nasa sila yung mga sipiat legally. Again, sila duha. The error must be mutual, again, silang duha, and the real purpose of the parties is frustrated. So when one of the parties is unable to read and fraud is alleged, burden of proof on party enforcing the contract. So what happens when one of the parties is unable to read? Meaning, wala siya kasabot sa kung sige pirmahan niya. Because di man siya kabalong basa. Tapos, nakapirma na siya and he or she is alleging that there is fraud. Okay, sa mga, this applies to those people nga taka lang pirma. Okay, tapos maingon sila nga, ay, giilad man ko anan niya. So the person enforcing the contract must show that the terms thereof have been fully explained to the former. So the one nga nagpapirma sa kontrata, masito it or mapalabas niya and mapatunayan niya dapat nga kaning kontratahan even if dili na siya kabalo mo basa is na-explain na kung tarong sa iya and at the same time nitando siya. So sa ngalan nga nitando siya, then there is meeting of the minds. The paper and pen are just formalities of the agreement. So inexcusable mistake. So of course, bisan pag mayon ka nga nasipyat ka pero sa ngalan niya kabalo ka, There's no running from it. Article 1333, there is no mistake if the party alleging it knew the doubt. Of course, if kabalo na ka nga there are certain doubt, contingency, or risk affecting the object of the contract, then you could not allege that there is mistake. For example, you will be buying a house tapos nakita na nimo daan niya murag laspag naman kay ni nga balay or murag namay lain tag-iya ni nga balay. But knowing those doubts, contingency, and the risk involving the contract of sale, then ipadayon gihapon nimo ang pagpalit. Then later on natumpag jud ang balay and later on na na ang kunlain. Tas moingon gihapon ka nga nakana giilad man ko ana niya nasipyat ra man ko ato. Then those are not valid grounds because again, kabalo naman ka. Kasi tawag na negligence on your part. Okay, there is negligence, kapabayaan sa imuhang part. And to some extent, katangahan na rin. Okay? Party cannot allege error which refers to a fact known to him or which he should have known by ordinary diligent examinations of the fact. Violence and intimidation. So, mo nitong ginaano no, mo nitong gina-allege sa katong sa ni mga accused no mga suspects sa Dasera rape case no nga ni pirma sila because they were intimidated. Gingnan sila sa mga pulis nga sige kung di ka mo pirma makulong ka, mabulo ka sa kulungan. So these are forms of these are grounds nga ma-vitiate ang consent and thus regardless kung katong ilang gipirmahan bisan pag nasa pirma didto that might be invalidated because there is intimidation. So Article 1335, there is violence when in order to wrest consent, serious or resistible force is employed. There is intimidation when one of the contracting parties is compelled by a reasonable and well-grounded fear of an imminent and grave evil upon his person or property, or upon the person or property of his spouse, descendants, ascendants to give his consent. So when we talk of intimidation, this is the presence of fear of an imminent and grave evil. So something like katong nahitabo sa sa suspects sa Christine Dasera rape case wherein gihadlok sila sa mga police that if they do not sign the statement, the ready-made statement, they will be in prison. So no choice daw sila as of that moment, ni-sign na lang sila. But later on, gibawi nila ang statement because saying that alleging that the police officers intimidated them or gihadlok sila. So those are intimidation. So if your consent, if your signature, if your agreement was secured by the other party because of intimidation, then the consent is deemed vitiated and at the same time resulting to a voidable contract. To determine the degree of intimidation, the age, sex, and condition of the person shall be borne in mind. So it will really depend on the case, depende kung bata ba nang involved, tigulang ba involved, babae ba, lalaki, or the condition of the person, pobre ba or dato ba, naabay political power or just a lay person, not a lay person, an ordinary person. So if there is presence of danger or duress, degree of constraint or danger, either actually inflicted or threatened, impending sufficient to overcome the might. So whether your consent has been secured through violence nga kanang kulata na ka diha para mutugan ka or para mo pirma ka or by means of intimidation, it will still result to a voidable contract. So when we talk of violence, physical force or compulsion, external and generally serve to prevent an act from being done. So what are the requisites of a violence? Physical force employed. Gikulata ba ka, gisumbag ba ka, gibunalan ba ka, and must be irresistible, or such a degree that the victim has no other course. You have no choice. That such force is the determining cause in giving the consent to the contract. So be reminded that even if there is violence, pero dili na siya mao ang naging ano ni? Naging hinungdan nganong napugos ka, then it might be investigated. Depende lang gyapon. Okay? What else? 1336, violence or intimidation shall annul the obligation, although it may have been employed by a third person who did not take part in the contract. Undue influence. So, what is this? Any means employed upon a third party which, under the circumstance, he could not well resist and which controlled his volition and induced him to give his consent. So, this is another tawag nito. Kaya tawagan na vices man siguro tawagan ni. With regards to consent, kung ganina natay violence, natay intimidation, this time undue influence. There is an undue influence, there's no violence, there's no sa tong term ganina. There's no intimidation, walay katong grave evil or danger, but simple as it may be as simple as doing favor, o kumbaga kaning tawhanan ni daghan nagibuhat para sa imo daw kay kagutang kabubuton, tapos gigamit niya ang influence niya sa imuha to lead you into doing something nga dili maayo. Something like siya ang nagpasulod sa imuha sa trabaho, and this time gusto niya nga pirmahan nimo na to release a certain amount of funds even if dili na siya dapat, but since naa siya influence sa imuha, natay ginatawag nga undue influence. So if ever you have given your consent in those circumstances wherein undue influence is present, it will still lead into avoidable contract. Okay, this time we are fraud. Vitiate the consent only when it refers to the matters mentioned in Article 1331. Mistake induced by fraud will always vitiate consent. So this time, kung katong ganina, nasipyat ta out of our own decision without any fraud, walay pagpangilad na nahitabo, nasipyat lang yun ta sa atuang judgment. Then, most of the time, the contract will still be valid. However, if we have made mistake in entering into a contract mali because giilad ta from the very first place, in the very beginning giilad ta, there is existence of fraud na ay mga dili mao nga statement nga gihatag sa ato in order to secure our consent, then it will still lead into a voidable contract. Insidious words and machinations constituting deceit. Okay, deceit includes false promises, exaggerations of hopes or benefits, abuse of confidence, fictitious name, qualification, or authority. So long as there is that fraud and maunto sa ang hinungdan nga nung na-secure niya ang consent nimo, then that's it. Marag katong I think it was in Korea na nagpakasal sila nagpakasal ang lalaki sa kaningang babae believing that this girl is really beautiful. Tapos later on, unfortunately, when they had their children, tingala siya nga murag lahi ara magdagway niya kung mga, well, basically na niladan sa sayahang mga anak, pangitan niya sayang mga anak. Tapos dito siya murag nagka-idea ba nga kaning bayhana siguro ni retokada jud siguro ni, and lo and behold retokada jud ay. So since sa iyahang case, well, nagminyo sa atong bayhana to kay giganahan sa gwapahan sa endol, so mo to ang naging deciding factor nga nung ihatag niya yung consent into marriage, and since na fraud na ilad siya, so gipaanal na cancel ang marriage nila. Wait lang guys. Okay, what else? All the 1,001 forms of deception which may influence the consent of a contracting party without necessarily constituting estafa or some offense under the penal law. So, kinds of fraud, kinds of pagpangilad na tinatawag nga dolo cosante, which is the consent given was really secured by means of the deceit or the fraud. Without M, he would not have agreed to. Pero napunta ginatawag nga dolo incidente does not have such decisive influence and by itself cannot cause the giving of the consent. So these are just incidental fraud nga without them or with them, the consent will still be secured. So if it is just dolo incidente, then it will not affect the entirety or the validity of the contract. Only the person nga naka-cause aning dolo incidente will be obliged to pay for damages. So there are also instances wherein even if wala kay giingon or wala kay giingon nga daotan pero gitago nimo ang tinuod, that may be constituted as fraud as well. 1339, failure to disclose facts when there is duty, okay? The keyword is there is duty to reveal them. It is your duty and obligation to tell the truth pero wala nimo giingon or failure to disclose them, okay, constitutes fraud. Kay murara na siya ganang wala mo kay gihimong mali pero wala mo kay gihimong tama. So it is just like that. Okay, however, usual exaggerations in trade, opportunity to know the facts, not fraud. So, when we go to the marketplace, pag natay ka deal nga mga seller, of course, they would not tell you nga pangit nilang cellphone, pangit nilang baligya. They would always give you things or reasons for you to buy their product. Murag mag-market yun si PLDT, magbalay-balay sila, magpataod sila nga, ay, okay man dyan kayo ang internet sir, kana ako, PLDT man po ko, pero never dyan ko naka-experience ana, and all. So in that case, if it is used in trade, okay, considering that you have the opportunity to do some research, to do some questioning sa mga proper nga mga tao or sa mga previous nga mga customers ni PLDT, okay, it is not considered fraud. Kay the usual exaggerations in trade when the other party had the opportunity to know the facts are not in themselves fraudulent. Kay probably tinuod to siya but it's not the kanang ginaingon nila ba nga it's only half of the truth. Okay? Especially kay trade ko na siya, kailangan yun nila makahalin. They are marketing people. That's why they would only tell you the best part about their product. They will not tell you the worst part. Okay, tolerated fraud or lawful misrepresentation, dolus bonus, as long as they do not go to the extent of malice or bad faith, such as changing the appearance of the thing by false devices and of preventing all verification or discovery of the truth by the other party. So, pero if there are instances wherein naana joy malice, naanay bad faith, there is that intention na makapagpangilad, okay, by changing the appearance of the thing. For example, nasa libaligya nga kotse, hamis kayo sa gawas, but ang engine day gitaya-taya na tapos maingon lang silang ay goods yung gaya ni kanang dili man makita kay gipinturahan man or gitabunan man something. And napod sila kunuhay, nagdala pod sila mekaniko kunuhay tapos binayran lang po diya ito. So that may constitute fraud. But if it is just katong ginatawag na to nga lawful misrepresentations, walay gitago pero wala po giingon tanan, then that's just it. But at the same time, we should not also put all the blame, all the accountability sa part sa seller. At ang ginatawag nga caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, or the buyer must beware. Okay? Dapat accountability jud sa buyer kung unsa na iyang ginasudlan. Do not give rise action for damages because of their insignificance or because the stupidity of the victim is the real cause of his loss. Sagpa kayo niyo, no? Because the stupidity of the victim is the real cause. Kung kabubuhan mo talaga yun or katangahan mo talaga yun, wag mong isisi yun sa iba. Okay? Mere expression of an opinion, not fraud. Okay? When you try to purchase a house, tapos adto ka dito sa iyang silingan, okay ba nga balay? Tapos moingon siya, ay okay man na dira. Tapos pagpalit na nimo dili day okay. Will you sue that neighbor of yours? Answer is not necessarily, because those are just mere opinions. At the same time, they have limited resources or limited lang knowledge about certain things. That is why it is just opinions. However, if ang imong gipangutana is an expert and relied upon by the plaintiff, nga ikaw mismo nga walang kamalay-malay, nag-rely ka kay lagi expert man siya, only to find out nga yes, probably expert yun siya with all the credentials, tapos mali ang iyahang gihatag nga or nakakosog damage ang iyahang opinion nga gihatag, then that's the time you could file for damages. A mere expression of an opinion that does not signify fraud unless made by an expert and the other party has relied on the former's special knowledge. Like for example, there's one person who is known, aware na judge ay aware na ang mga tao kaning tawanan ni how jud ni siya in terms of stock market. Tapos he's really claiming kaning stock jud kanang mutaas jud ni for the next 2 to 3 months. And based on that expert's advice, butang na may imong kwarta, well, not really, di na lang tanong stocks because there is an incorporated risk with regards to that. Doctor na lang. Doctor nagsuggest sa imo nga you need to undergo this surgery because money makapayo sa imo. Then after the surgery, nakasama na noon siya sa imo. In that instance, since expert man siya and the opinion of an expert must be taken as truth or facts. So if it did not work or it did not work well, then we may annul the contract or demand for indemnification for damages. Okay, misrepresentation by a third person. Misrepresentation by a third person does not vitiate consent unless such misrepresentation has created substantial mistake and the same is mutual. So general rule, if ang misrepresentation is conducted by a third person outside of the parties, then generally it does not vitiate or lead into avoidable contract. However, if a third person is in collusion with one of the parties na ay kanang nagkuntsaba, is considered an accomplice to the fraud and the contract becomes voidable. Okay. Next one is simulation of contracts. Kaning simulation of contracts, this is a declaration of a fictitious will. Naadjud na siya intention nga magpagpangilad. Nagbuhat-buhat sila gilang kagalingong contract with all the simulated objects and all simulated parties deliberately made by the agreement of parties in order to produce for the purpose of deception. So kani siya nga mga instances void yun siya. Because wala man in the very first place, it is a fictitious contract. Walay valid object, gamit sila og mga influence makaron or intimidation, fraud in order to secure consent. So saksak sinagol na nga mga violations. And thus, what's the effect? Simulation of a contract may be absolute or relative. So there's two. For those nga intended to be nga pagpangilad jud ang hinungdan nga nung ingato nga kontrata, that's void, null and void. However, if it's just partial is simulated lang, but siguro nag-simulate lang nila to increase the price or to increase the value, but the object is really there, then they will just be relatively or partly liable. So, matong effects. An absolutely simulated or fictitious contract is void, but a relatively simulated, okay, when it does not prejudice a third person, it is not intended for any purpose contrary to law, morals, good customs, public policy, binds the parties to their real agreement. So, kung unsa jud to ilahang dapat nga agreement, okay, regardless kung unsa to nga buhat-buhat, for example, gipalabas nga gibaligya ang kotse sa iyang kaila, pero di ay to gihatag lang. So the contract, it's ang simulated dito is the contract of saleman, but what really happened was a contract of donation. So the contract of donation will be the one to be valid, and the parties will still be bounded to that real contract. However, if kunuhay na ay gibaligya ka kotse pero wala dito gibaligya, there's no price at all, walay buyer, walay seller, murag gibuhat lang nila para probably to increase the market value of the car. Okay, something like palitono na unta nimo, tapos ningon siya, ay dili na, ay naa na may nakauna sir, kay ana. Pero kung paliton nimo mas higher nga price, sir, kanang basin pwede na nato i-cancel. So kato, fictitious yun siya, no? Nay contract nga fictitious in order to raise the value, then that's void. Okay, let's now go to the objects of the contract. We're done with consent already. It's now with the object. Basically, these are just things, rights or service, which is the subject matter of the obligation. Mura lang gyapon siya katong sa obligation nga part before. Object of the contract and the object of the obligation created thereby are identical. So the object and contracts and the object and obligations nga na-discuss nato are just the same. What may be the object of contracts? So ano bang pwede nating maging objects in terms of contracts? All things which are not outside the commerce of men, including future things, may be the object of a contract. All rights which are not intransmissible may also be the objects of contract. So basically, tanan. Okay, so long as it's not outside the commerce of men, even if it is a future thing. No contract may be entered into upon future inheritance except in cases expressly authorized by law. So generally speaking, di mo pwede baligya ang yuta sa imuhang mamagpapa nga buhi pa sila or wala pa na transfer sa imuha, because in the first place, dili man na imuha. Even if sigurado nga ikaw ang makamana na. All services which are not contrary to law, morals, good custom, public order, public policy may likewise be the object of contract. Question: could we enter into a contract wherein you have to sell cocaine or shabu? Answer is no, because it is contrary to law. So dili ta pwede mag-engage into a contract nga violations sa law, morals, good custom, public order, public policy. The same with the sa katong obligations before. Okay? All things not outside the commerce of man, including future things, do not belong to the obligor at the time the contract is made. They may be made. Okay? Even if wala pa sa imuha, dili pa ikaw ang tag-iya sa kanang nga butanga, you may enter into a contract provided that upon the delivery of, or upon the fulfillment of the contract, ikaw ang tag-iya atong object. For example, you will be selling a piece of land to a person, and as of now, dili pa imuha because gina-negotiate pa pod nimo. Pero ang date pampod sa imuhang pagkabaligya is next year. So I am entering into a contract wherein ibaligyan ako ni nga yuta sa imuha next year. So as of now, bisan pag dili pa ako ang tag-iya sa yuta, pwede pa na siya so long as next year makuha nimo. Rights are acquired by the obligor after the perfection of the contract. Okay, personal rights. Marital authority, status. Sa man siya. So outside the commerce of man, all kinds of things in interest, whose alienation or free exchange is restricted by law or stipulation, which parties cannot modify at will. So when an object is considered outside the commerce of man, then it may not be an object of the obligation or the contract rather. Services which imply an absolute submission by those who render them, sacrificing their liberty, dili po na siya pwede. Okay? Example, slavery. Dili pwede nga mag-engage ka. Mabitaw nang dili pwede ng, for example, na siya utang 100,000 tapos, sige, para mabayaran na may mo utang, himonti kang katabang sa balay, wala kay bayad for the next 2 years. Pwede ba na siya? The answer is no. Slavery man na. Dapat, sulduhan mo siya, didakan lang mo siya from time to time. Personal rights, dili po na siya pwede mahimong contract, ma-include as an object of contract. So, example, marital authority. You cannot just make a contract wherein sige, mag-engage tayo into a contract. Instead, ikaw ang magpakasal, ako ang magpakasal na imuhang asawahon. So, the marital authority cannot be sold or cannot be entered into a contract. Public office, inherent attributes of the public authority, political rights. So, dili po na siya pwede ibaligya nga. Sige, ibaligya na lang ako niyang pagka-mayor sa imo ha. Because, or right of suffrage, ako na lang mo boto para sa imo ha in behalf of you. Because those are personal as well. Sa paman. Sacred things, air and sea, dili po pwede because nobody owns the air, nobody owns the sea. Kaya bisag ka nang ginaingon nila nga dagat ni tatay, di yun na dagat ni tatay. Ang shoreline lang ang naiyaha. Mura man ang ibaligya. Ang dagat mismo, wala dyan yung nagapanagayaan ng dagat. Ay ang Pilipinas. For example, kanang dagatan nasa Pilipinas. Ang nagapanagayaan na ang Pilipinas. Ang lote lang ay mo pwede maangkunan na. Ito nasa tungod sa dagat. So, requisites of an object within the commerce of man, ano itong i-discuss na ito kanina. Licit must not be illegal. Possible, okay? It should not be impossible. Say ang iyang creation or if this is a future object, the existence of this object is possible. Example, kanang harvest sa imuhang basakan, pwede mo na ibaligya even if wala pa. So, pwede because it is possible nga sooner or in few months, maka-harvest naman ka. Determinate as to its kind. What may not be the objects of contracts, baliktad lang. Itong mga illegal, dili pwede. Indeterminable as to their kind, outside the commerce of man, intransmissible rights, future inheritance. Okay, you just read through them. And lastly, last essential requisite of the contract is cause. We're done with object, we're done with consent. We're now the cause. Napaspasan lang nato guys, no? Kaya medyo taas-taas dyan ang discussion so far. Okay? Why of a contract, the immediate and the most proximate purpose of the contract? The essential reason which impels the contracting parties to enter. So, it's actually kanang ginatawag na itong cause and object. It really depends on whose perspective are you taking into. For example, ako si buyer. Okay? Siyempre, for me to buy, nganong nisulod ko into a contract? Because of the object. Okay? The object is my cause. I have entered into a contract because I wanted to secure that object. Ang cause na ko is to secure or to buy that object, and I have to give my consent as well. On the part of the seller, the cause is actually the money. The money of the buyer. So, muna ginaingon nga, in a contract, the cause of the other is also the object of the other. It depends kung kinsa nga perspective imong ginatan-aw. So in a contract of sale, the cost for the buyer is the object, and on the perspective of the seller, the cost is the money the cost is the money. So the cost must exist, it must be true, and it must be licit. As distinguished from object, object is the starting point of the agreement. Na ay kotse, na ay balay, na ay baligya, and that is why that's the starting point of the agreement. You have entered into a contract centered around the object. So si seller, ihatag niya ang object in exchange for the money. Si buyer, ihatag po niya ang money in exchange of the object, without which the negotiation and the bargaining between parties will never have begun. Okay, unsa may sabutan nila, unsa may ilahang i-negotiate in the first place kung walay object. Object may be the same for both of the parties. Cost is different with respect to each party. As distinguished from consideration, consideration is less than cost. Consideration and cost, reason or motive. Mo siyang cost, the reason or the motive or inducement by which a man is moved into bind himself by the agreement. The cost is the why of the contracts. $13.50 in onerous contract. When we say onerous, these are burdensome contracts. There is exchange of values coming from the parties. In onerous contracts, the cost is understood to be for each contracting party the prestation or promise of a thing or service by the other, and to the other party it is the remuneration or the payment for the service or the product being given. So again, the cost for the other is also the object for the other. Onerous contracts, prestation or promise of a thing or service by the other need not be adequate or an exact equivalent so long as they agree on the exchange of value or the exchange of goods. Remuneratory contracts. One where a party gives something to the other because of some service. So, mura siya trabaho. Let us engage into a contract of employment. So, you will be rendering your service to me, I'll be paying you money. Dili man na siya onerous, because sa onerous man good, exchange of more or less the same value. Exchange of, sa contract of sale. Okay, sa remuneratory, exchange of service, tapos bayad on the other. Dapat tayo ginatawag nga gratuitous contracts. Donation, maghatag kog butang sa imuha, I will not receive anything. You will only be the one to benefit from the contract. Wala siya gratuitous. As distinguished from motive, 1351, the particular motives of the parties in entering into a contract are different from the cause thereof. Because motives, it may or may not be determined upon the happening of the contract. Like for example, contract of sale, the cost might be on one party is the money, the cost on of the other is the car nga ibaligya. Pero ang motive nga nung gipalit, probably gamiton sa business for personal use, it is not the same as the cost and may not be indicated as well. So kung mangutana siya, unsa din mo ning kotse, you have the right not to answer. Okay? General rule, motive does not affect the validity of the contract. Because in the first place, wa man siya labot. Okay? Labot ba nato para asa niya niyang nganong gi-employ ta niya? Okay? Kung ano bang unsa bay labot nato nganong gipalit na niya nga sakyanan, sa may labot nato kung gipalit na niya nga balay. So motive is for chismoso lang. Okay, but for the purpose of the contract, wala siya labot. Only the object, the cause, and the consent. Defective causes. So when can causes be defective? Absence of cause and unlawful cause produces no effect whatever. So for example, simulated contracts. So simulated contracts, the very cause nga nung na-simulated contract is makapangilad. So makapangilad is something that is unlawful. So if it is because of an unlawful cause, or wala lang, trip lang, buhat lang tag-contract, pabibo lang, kunuhay. So, it produces no effect whatever. Statement of a false cause in a contract. Void if there is no other true and lawful cause. So, just like in simulated contracts, if it is really false or di jud mao, they're just there to cause havoc and chaos, charis. Okay? So, and if mali jud, then it is void if there are no other true lawful cause. Lesion or inadequacy of cause, valid unless fraud, mistake, or undue. So, for example, if I will be the one to sell a car, tapos naay mo palit, tapos katong nga car is a car of my si term ano kanang alaga na ako ba niya ako nagabantay sa yahas, ako siya nagapuyo, ako yung guardian. Tapos if he or she suffers damages or kumbaga dili equal dili fair ang pagkabaligya sa iyahang properties, because ako ang gusto lang makakwarta lang ko without really considering the value of the product or the item, causing lesion or inadequacy of cause, then it may be valid unless there is fraud, mistake, or undue influence is present. However, if there's no fraud, mistake, or undue influence, then the contract, it will, even if it is inadequate, the exchange of value is inadequate, it will still be valid. Okay, so that's quite a lot, no? Medyo taas-taas din siya. And supposedly, this should be discussed for, I think, 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks because of the length. But then again, due to time constraint, ang ipaspasan na nato. So, here is the application. How do parties usually communicate consent in contracts? What makes an object of a contract invalid, and how do you explain a cause for one party is also the object to another? So that ends Law 101 for this semester. I really hope namoy naton kahit papaano, even in spite of the pandemic that we are encountering. So I think that's it. Good day and God bless.